Good evening, I'm Gerard Holland and once again have the privilege of sitting in for Nick Cater whilst he's away in the US. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight for Reality Bites. Well, tonight in the show we're going to be hearing from US energy commentator Robert Bryce, energy economist Professor Stephen Wilson, and of course your usual host Nick Cater, beamed in from North America, DC I understand, to unpack the biggest issues of the week and facing the nation. All of that and more coming up tonight on Reality Bites. New ABS figures this week confirm what we've all been feeling. The economy is in a grim state. Not since 1990 has the Australian economy been in such dire straits. Officially, we're not in a full-blown recession, but don't be fooled, households are. Record migration and runaway government spending have propped up the numbers, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. Families and businesses are struggling to make ends meet, and there's no magic fix in sight. For 7 straight quarters, GDP per capita, a measure of how much each of us produces, has gone backwards. That's the longest slump on record. Meanwhile, inflation stays high whilst productivity remains low. Workers aren't producing more for each hour they work, so the cost of labour keeps rising. This hits businesses where it hurts, driving up prices for everyone. And when prices go up, interest rates follow, piling even more pressure on households. Government spending hasn't helped. In fact, it's part of the problem. Both state and federal governments are spending more than ever, taking up 28% of the economy. Another record. And this spending hasn't been covered by tax receipts. Borrowing has hit $40 billion in just one quarter, the equivalent of $1,700 for each working-age Australian. This might keep the economy limping along in the short term, but it's future generations who'll foot the bill. And while the public sector balloons, the private sector, the real engine of the economy, is left gasping for air. As 375,000 jobs were created last year in the taxpayer-funded care economy, 63,000 of which were in public administration, mind you, more than 90,000 jobs have disappeared from hospitality, 26,000 have been lost in wholesale trade, and another 6,000 in manufacturing. In October of this year, Australia recorded over 1,300 business insolvencies, another record, the highest monthly total. And this was just off the back of 11,000 companies entering external administration in the 23-24 financial year, a 39% increase from the previous year. So how do we get here? For starters, productivity has collapsed. Red tape and overlapping regulations have made it almost impossible for businesses to thrive. Take the agricultural sector in Victoria, where a single business must comply with 90 state regulations and 37 federal ones. In Queensland, environmental regulations alone run to nearly 3 million words. This is bureaucracy at its worst, draining time, money and energy from the people who want to get on with the job. But this has been compounded by the state's relentless expansion, which is squeezing the life out of the private sector. Businesses responsible for 6 out of 7 jobs in this country are being pushed to the sidelines, unable to compete with government-backed demand and borrowing. Supply constraints, inflated costs, and rising taxes are choking private sector growth, leaving little room for innovation or resilience. Instead of being the engine of our economy, the private sector is being stifled, while government largesse drives up debt and inflation, leading to future generations to pay the price. And then there's energy policy, or the lack of a coherent one. Instead of focusing on reliable, affordable power, governments have been chasing ideological goals. The result? Sky-high electricity bills. Right now, more than 130,000 households are on hardship payment plans because they simply can't afford to pay their bills. Energy relief programs might soften the blow, but they don't fix the underlying problem. Energy is too expensive, and businesses and families are paying the price. Mass migration, too, has played its part. Bringing in people to fill jobs sounds good in theory, but it's masked deeper issues. Instead of investing in productivity, we've leaned on mass migration to drive demand. And this puts even more pressures on services, infrastructure and the housing market. Rents are through the roof, schools are overcrowded and hospitals are stretched to the limit. It's a quick fix that's causing long-term damage. We can't keep going like this. To dig ourselves out of this hole, we need to rethink how we run this country. First, energy policy needs a complete overhaul. Forget ideology. What Australians need is power that's cheap, reliable and sustainable. And I mean sustainable in the sense of intergenerational. If we can bring down energy costs, we can ease the burden on households and businesses alike. Second, we need to cut this regulatory mess. Businesses should be free to grow and innovate without spending half their time wading through paperwork and compliance. Streamlining laws and reducing red and green tape would give the private sector the breathing room it desperately needs. Third, government spending has to be reined in. It's not about cutting essential services, it's about making sure every dollar spent delivers real value. That means tackling waste and focusing on outcomes, not just throwing money at the problems. Fourth, we need to rethink migration. It's not about shutting the door, it's about managing demand and ensuring our services and infrastructure can cope. Quality, not just quantity, needs to be the goal. Finally, we need to make Australia a more attractive place to do business. That means rethinking tax and royalty rates to encourage investment and growth. If businesses are thriving, jobs will follow and the economy will grow. The bottom line is this: the economy is struggling and people are hurting. But this isn't just about numbers on a page, this is about real lives. Families worried about their next bills. Businesses wondering how much longer they can even keep on going. We need to stop tinkering around the edges and make some bold and decisive changes. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. But if we get energy policy right, slash bureaucracy, rein in spending and focus on the private sector, we can turn this around. Australians deserve better than what they're getting right now. And for both our state and federal governments, it's time to deliver. Turning to the US, Chris Wright's nomination as Secretary of Energy is exactly the sort of decision you'd expect from President-elect Trump. Bold, disruptive and guaranteed to ruffle a few feathers. Wright is no career politician. He's a man who spent his life transforming the energy industry, from spearheading the shale gas revolution to pushing forward next-generation nuclear technology. His leadership at Liberty Energy and investment in modular nuclear reactors shows he's not here to waste time. His energy manifesto, Bettering Human Lives, is as direct as the man himself. It calls out the nonsense around unrealistic energy policies and puts human progress front and centre. It champions hydrocarbons for what they are, essential, and pushes for real solutions like nuclear. Chris is no nonsense and passionately makes the case that zero energy poverty by 2050 is a superior goal compared to net zero 2050. Naturally, this will send the usual suspects into a frenzy. To dig into what all of this means, we've got Robert Bryce joining us from the US. Robert is a seasoned journalist, author and energy expert with over 3 decades of experience analysing global energy trends. Known for his incisive commentary, he's written 6 books, including Power Hungry and A Question of Power, and recently has produced a brilliant documentary on YouTube, Juice, a 5-part series on energy and its influence on the world. And he frequently appears in major media outlets to discuss the intersection of energy, economics and policy. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
So happy to be with you, my friend.
Robert, Chris Wright isn't your typical bureaucrat, is he? How might his no-nonsense industry background shake up the Department of Energy?
Well, in many ways, but before I talk about that, I think it's important, Jared, to put him into context. Ever since the Department of Energy was created, this job as Energy Secretary has been given to, apparatchiks and lawyers and academics. There's never been an energy industry executive or energy industry person who's gone on to lead the Department of Energy, and that is directly from the energy sector to the head spot. So that alone makes this noteworthy. For instance, Ronald Reagan, he appointed a guy who was a dentist to be the Secretary of Energy. So the fact that Chris really knows the energy sector, he's obviously works as a CEO and founder of Liberty Energy, which does hydraulic fracturing. So he knows oil and gas, but he's also a significant investor in the nuclear sector. He knows geothermal. He's the most qualified person ever to be nominated to be the Secretary of Energy, and I think he definitely will be confirmed.
Well, so how will Wright's nomination and really his policy focus alter the current trajectory of renewable energy adoption in the US? Obviously, shale, gas, hydrocarbons, nuclear, these are quite dense forms of energy. The old guard as the kind of renewables lobby would love to tell us. But what does that actually mean for what will happen with those kind of tech?
Well, difficult to predict, and I'll dive into that in just a second. But remember, the Department of Energy, Chris doesn't have, his portfolio doesn't decide all of that in terms of funding for renewables, et cetera. That takes Congress, right? So these massive subsidies that have been given to wind and solar and now batteries and some of these alternative energy forms, Congress will have to act to restrain or reduce the amount of subsidy going to those forms of energy. And so his role at Department of Energy, I think, is going to be constrained in that regard. But what I think the key thing that he will bring to this spot is the bully pulpit. And one of the things, and look, I'm not objective at all when it comes to Chris. I'm a reporter. I consider him a friend of mine. I've known him for more than a decade. And one of the things I really admire about him, and you pointed it out, is he's a realist. He's an energy realist, and in that, therefore, he's an energy humanist. And I'm all for that. As you pointed out, he's pro-human and he's pro-energy and pro-human. And in that regard, this is maybe the most important aspect of his nomination is that he's not ashamed to be in the energy business. He believes we need more energy for more people around the world, and that by itself is revolutionary when it comes to the filling of this spot. And so that's one of the things the NGOs, the Sierra Club and the rest of them, they're so objecting so strenuously because they don't like it that he's pro-energy. And so again, I think that part of this job, as his role and his ability to use the bully pulpit, I think will be the most important part of his job, as well as being pro-nuclear.
Well, I'd love to unpack that idea of like energy humanism and being an energy realist. And as I mentioned at the top of the segment, his Bettering Human Lives manifesto lands in his key takeaways that zero energy poverty by 2050 is a superior goal to net zero by 2050. What does this actually mean in practice, and what are the implications for the current status quo that we've been kind of trudging along with over the last couple of decades?
Sure. Well, about the point about zero energy poverty, one of the things that I love about Chris, and I do respect him a great deal, he's innovative, he's an entrepreneur. He has a favorite hydrocarbon. He loves propane, C3H8. And why does he love propane? Because he sees it as a fuel that can help reduce energy poverty, and that's key. And so, not only has he created this Bettering Human Lives report, he's launched a Bettering Human Lives Foundation to try and facilitate more availability of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, to more people in Africa. So that's key, and a key part of who he is as a human, as a humanist, and looking at energy as something that's and I've talked about this in my books and in my documentary. Darkness kills human potential, electricity nourishes it. And one of the things Chris and I share is this absolute revulsion at the fact that now there are over 3 million people a year. 3 million people per year die every year from indoor air pollution because they're using low-quality cooking fuels. So to put that in perspective, more people die from using low-quality fuels every year than die from AIDS, HIV, cholera, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. That's a scandal. And so, again, I think, Chris's ability to put and spotlight that injustice, I think, is going to be absolutely essential.
As you mentioned, Robert, this is something that you've been researching and writing and communicating about for a very long time now, and you have been one of those quite distinct voices who has been championing this pro-energy realist and pro-human agenda. One of the pieces of work that you did recently that I found fascinating was unpacking how energy poverty particularly impacts women and girls, and particularly in the developing world. How does reliable access to electricity transform the lives of women and girls in developing countries, and what does some of your research unpack?
Sure. Well, electricity, the way I put it is electricity frees women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. This ability to, electricity, it's a transformative form of energy. And so freeing women and girls from the drudgery of hauling water, the drudgery of collecting wood or dung for the stove, the drudgery of washing clothes by hand, all of these things are the burden of now roughly 2.5 billion women and girls around the world today. The late Hans Rosling, the demographer, estimated that there are 5 billion people walking around today on the planet who are walking around in clothes that have been washed by hand. Well, if there are 5 billion people walking around in clothes that have been washed by hand, that means there are probably 2.5 billion women and girls who are doing that washing. So if we're serious, and I say this as I'm not a partisan, but you look at the conservative liberal divide, and by that I mean the left versus the right. If the leftists are really interested, the liberals liberals are really interested in the welfare of women and girls, they should be interested in promoting the availability of cheap, abundant, reliable energy for everyone, particularly in the developing world, because that is the key to liberating women and girls from this life of drudgery and liberating from them from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub.
Robert, everything you're saying just sounds like an absolute obvious no-brainer, but it feels like that hasn't been the trajectory of our international institutions, be it the UN's SDGs or other, kind of globalist bodies. So what are the biggest barriers to expanding affordable energy in regions that are most affected by this energy poverty?
Sure. Well, I agree with you. I think it's so obvious even Ray Charles could see it. But the challenge in many of these countries, let's be clear, is one of them is corruption. And the darkness, theft is the enemy of light. So a lot of countries, Lebanon is a good example. The electric grid in Lebanon is weak. Why? Because the corruption in the society is just, it's generational. Same in places like Nigeria. So corruption is going to be a difficult part of the equation to solve. And grids have to be self-sustaining, electric grids. People have to pay for their electricity. They can't steal it. They have to buy it to make these systems sustainable, and that by that I mean economically sustainable. So corruption is a big one, but also we have to get past this bias and hubris, I think, in the West of limiting the availability of funding via the World Bank or bilateral, multilateral lending entities, so that developing countries can get access to capital, so they can drill for oil, so they can build nuclear power plants, so they can build coal-fired power plants. Yes, I said coal-fired power plants, building gas-fired power plants. Hydrocarbons are here to stay, and the only way we're going to bring the billions of people who are living in energy poverty today out of energy poverty is with the help of hydrocarbons, and a lot of them.
Well, one of the buzzwords in the developing world, or the development space, I should say, is really this idea of microgrids and decentralised grids, and how renewables provide a huge new opportunity for those kind of remote locations to actually get electrified in a way that wouldn't be provided by traditional baseload, dispatchable, centralised power. Through your research, how do renewable energy solutions like solar and wind actually stack up in addressing energy poverty compared to fossil fuels or even nuclear?
Well, there's a lot to talk about there. Let's start with nuclear. Nuclear has a lot of potential, and what we're seeing a comeback for nuclear around the world in a lot of places. And I think you're going to see it develop most quickly in Eastern Europe and probably in France and Canada. We're seeing some increased interest here in nuclear in the U.S. And also some in Africa. But remember, again, you have to have stable societies to make nuclear happen. You have to have a lot of things to be happening right in a society for nuclear to develop. But as far as solar and wind, I'm not going to say bad things about solar. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar on the roof of my house here in Austin, Texas. But you don't build solar panels with solar panels. You build them with coal-fired power plants. You can't build a modern manufacturing economy or or operate a major city like Nairobi or any number of cities in or Johannesburg or Alexandria or Cairo. You can't run those cities on solar power. I mean, that's a joke. It can't be done, won't be done. So these developing countries, with in Pakistan, India, New Delhi, Agra, these cities, these massive and municipalities all around the world, they need baseload power, and you can't do that with wind and solar. So we're going to have to develop more coal. We're natural gas and nuclear, end to end, is my platform. I've been saying the same thing for decades now. Natural gas to nuclear. If we're serious about providing more power to more people with low or no carbon, then that's the way forward. Natural gas resources are available globally. They are super abundant, low carbon. The technologies are well known, and the same with nuclear.
Robert, we're nearly out of time, but just to close us out, how can people follow your work? What have you got next on the horizon, and where should we go to see all the great stuff that you're doing?
Well, Well, thank you there. Well, so here's my latest book, Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. You don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. And you buy it on your Kindle. I make a better royalty. But I also am writing almost exclusively now on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. And then I'm easy to find on the Google. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on, as I said, on Substack. I'm on TikTok. Yeah, I'm on TikTok. I'm easy to find. So, but robertbryce.substack.com is where I do all my writing these days.
Robert, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and thanks for all the work you're doing, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
It's very kind. Thank you. Happy to do it, my friend.
Well, welcome back to Reality Bites. I'm Gerard Holland, sitting in for Nick Cater, and joining us from North America is the very man himself. Nick, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Gerard, for a very, very chilly Washington. I have to say it's about 4 below zero. But anyway, let's press on.
Well, I'm glad to be here where I am at the moment, I can assure you. Nick, you've been attending the annual forum of the International Democratic Union, which is the primary grouping of centre-right and pro-freedom parties from around the world. With barely 6 weeks to go before the inauguration of President Trump, what's the political atmosphere like?
Well, it feels like it is already Trump's America, Gerard. He's the one who's pulling the strings. Everybody's listening to him. Joe Biden, I gather, is overseas, but he's not getting much coverage here. All the attention is on what the Trump administration means, and Trump is already making an influence. So there was a wonderful example last week where he declared that he was going to put tariffs on Mexico and Canada unless they stopped the illegal migration across the border. And that prompted Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, to fly to Mar-a-Lago to sit and chat to Trump and see if he could talk him out of it. So Trump is really having an influence not just here in the States but in world affairs. There's a sense that this second term he's coming back much better prepared. He's done a lot of work. He's got a very good team behind him. He knows what he's got to do. There's a sense that he only has 2 years to do it in because he's only got one remaining term, and of course you hit that lame duck period. So they've got to hit the deck running, and all the indications are that's what they're about to do.
Nick, I'm conscious that there's only so much that you can say, as Chatham House rules apply to much of what's gone on at this IDU conference that you've been visiting. But you did hear from a number of senior Democrats, including President Trump's pick for National Security Advisor. That would be Congressman Mike Waltz. What changes can we expect in American strategic and foreign policy, do you think? Well,
I think what we're going to see is Trump picking up where he left off. This has been forgotten, of course, by much of the press and the commentariat, but because Trump's initiative in the Abraham Accords, which is where he struck agreements largely with the Gulf states, so they struck partnerships with the Gulf states to kind of deal the Palestinian question out of the equation so they could come to some peace of understanding in the Middle East in which the Palestinians weren't central. That was, of course, knocked on the head. Their attempts to get Saudi Arabia on board were knocked on the head by the October 7th attack. And they now intend to come back and resume that process. Trump, obviously, interestingly this week, said that he wanted to see the hostages released, and if they weren't released by the time he took power, they'd be held to pay. That's a bit of an echo back to the Reagan era when Reagan took over Jimmy Carter, and one of the first things he did was to secure the release of the Iranian, the hostages, US hostages from Iran in the US embassy. And so you've got this wonderful parallel. I mean, now we have the Hamas-held hostages and Hamas being an Iranian proxy. So I think that what they're going to do in the Middle East is go full bore for Iran. They can't ignore Iran anymore and just deal with the proxies. They want the downfall of the Iranian regime. I think, too, they're going to be a lot tougher in Ukraine than people have been saying.
Well, staying with the Middle East, Nick, Australia this week voted to support an independent Palestine at the UN. How did that decision go down in the US?
Terribly. Honestly, it feels you're quite embarrassed in a way for your own government, for your own country when they make a decision like that. I spoke to a couple of Australian politicians, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, this evening. He'd been up in Capitol Hill with some meetings this afternoon. He said it was frankly very difficult to explain to the Americans what had gone wrong, because Australia was always a very firm ally of Israel and, of course, the US. And here's the thing, of course, Gerard, we're now at odds with our best and most important ally. They're thoroughly behind the Trump regime and behind Israel. And Stephen Harper just passed by, the Prime Minister of Canada. So the US is thoroughly behind Israel, and they're surprised that their solid, formerly staunch ally, Australia, takes a different view on that.
Well, speaking of differing views of some of our allies, the narrative of the commentariat really seems to be that Trump will walk away from supporting the Ukraine. What's your take on that? Do you think this is accurate?
No, I don't. Not at all. I mean, Trump, sure, he's a deal maker, but he's not going to take a bad deal, and he certainly won't take anything that gives Russia the upper hand. Much of this narrative, I'm sure, Gerard, is driven by that Democrat myth that was put around that Trump was in Russia's pocket, was a great ally of Putin's. That, of course, turned out to be completely wrong. It was a complete myth. Still on the ABC website, I have to say. So I think that's driving some of this. And the fact is that Trump, when he was in power last time, gave Ukraine its first serious weapon, the Javelin missile. Not only that, he gave the Green Berets to help train them in the use of that Javelin missile. I don't think for one moment he's going to walk away from Ukraine right now. Sure, he wants peace. I mean, we all want peace there. But it's not going to be on any terms. It's going to be on terms that leave Ukraine intact.
Getting quite a bit of feedback there, Nick. I think you're clearly live on location. But talking about the Democrats, and you talked about this Ukrainian being a bit of a idea being a myth that was sort of propagated in the lead up to the election. Well, post the election, obviously, it didn't go as well as they were hoping. What have you learned about the Trump campaign and the fallout for the Democrat Party?
Well, it's fascinating. The Democrats have been poring over this ever since. They still don't know quite what went wrong. And I think what it came down to, and we heard from some of the leading campaigners for Trump this afternoon, and what they were saying, was, Trump stuck to the script. He knew that what most Americans were concerned about wasn't abortion, it wasn't climate change. It was the cost of living, it was the fact there were too many migrants, the borders seemed to be wide open, and the fact that America no longer seemed like a strong country anymore. So Trump kept to those themes, and that's why they voted for him. The Democrats still haven't come to terms with quite why they lost. I think they were so detached from voters, they had no idea what was on ordinary voters' minds, and they thought Trump was just rambling and carrying on, whereas in fact, he was entirely disciplined in his campaign. He had some clear themes, and he'd repeat them over and over again, and they were the cost of living, taxation, immigration principally, and the fact that nobody respected America anymore, that it was a weaker country. And he stuck to those themes, and people responded to that. And they didn't respond to abortion and to climate change, which were the kind of things that the Democrats were pushing. And the Democrats' attempts to sort of rubbish his character, none of that had any impact whatsoever. In fact, some polling we saw today from Lord Ashcroft polls showed that 20% of the people who thought that Trump couldn't be trusted and that he was morally corrupt still voted for him anyway. So I think it challenges the idea that politics is a popularity contest, isn't it? I think it is to an extent, but if people think a leader is strong and they think he's going to do the right thing for the country, they don't actually have to necessarily like him, particularly if the opposition, the opposing candidate is somebody like Kamala Harris.
Well, Nick, I think that's all we've got time for, but I'm sure you're in need of getting under cover and maybe getting under a warm blanket. Mate, thanks so much for your time and looking forward to having you back in Oz.
Thanks for keeping the shop. I'll see you back in Sydney.
No worries, mate. More from us after the break. Welcome back to Reality Bites. You're here with Gerard Holland. Well, as I mentioned at the top of the show, ABS figures released this week paint a dire picture for the current state of the economy. We've avoided a countrywide recession due to two key factors: mass migration and record levels of government spending. both of which are fueling inflation, high interest rates, declining living standards, and record levels of state and federal debt that will be passed on to the next generation. Yet whilst neither of these trends can continue, the burden can't be placed on young families, who are by definition the future of our country, to pick up the tab. The federal government borrowed $40 billion in the last quarter alone, which is bad enough. But when that stealth tax called inflation remains stubbornly high due to this excessive spending and is eroding the value of what little cash we've got left, what kind of future are we dumping on young Australians? And of course, one of the largest growing budget bottom lines is, of course, in the care sector. It's important to note that we've outsourced a lot of what care families used to provide, be it caring down for young children or caring up for the elderly, to the state. Is this social progress or just a costly mistake that will leave society worse off? So it would seem that one of the most important factors that would begin to reduce the size of the state is to have a cultural and economic system that reinforces stable and traditional family formation. Essentially what we've done as birth rates have declined is we've relied on mass migration to fill those gaps in the labour force. But mass migration puts more pressure on services, it puts more pressure on our institutions, on our schools and our hospitals, on rental prices, and as this incredible graph from macroeconomics has produced, which should be on your screen shortly, as immigration has increased, GDP per capita and productivity has declined. So we can't rely on migration to get us out of our economic woes. And at the same time, as family formation has fractured and broken up, a lot of those responsibilities of care that we used to keep in the home have been given and passed on to the state. So if we want to begin to cut back the state, it means that we have to focus on supporting and growing our families. The way to get GDP growth, the way to get our economy ticking on again, is not to force mums to get into the workforce as soon as possible after they've had children. And social study after social study proves time and time again that when women are given the choice, they want to spend more time with their kids and they want to have more children but are unable to due to cultural or economic factors, mainly around cost of living pressures. It's this balance between the resilience of our social fabric, making sure we have family policy that works for as many people as possible, the health of having a cohesive society. This is all as important as the economic narrative that we've been hearing in the media and the news since these abysmal figures came out. These aren't separate issues. A strong economy is dependent on a strong social fabric. And that goes down to all of us, not just governments, but businesses and the way that we talk about these things as a culture and in society. We have to do better for our families, we have to do better for mums, and we have to do better for our economy. Well, with the spectre of blackouts looming in New South Wales last week, the fragility of our energy grid has once again been thrust into the spotlight. To get to the truth of what's going on, I'm joined by Professor Stephen Wilson, a renowned energy economist and adjunct professor in the School of Mechanical and Mining Engineering. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Gerard, it's lovely to be with you.
Stephen, after the blackout risks in New South Wales last week, I was reminded of your brilliant analysis you call the yawning gap. I've used this a few times in different presentations. I should probably start paying you royalties for each time I drag it out. But for those watching at home, and we should have a graphic of it coming up in a second, and there's quite a lot going on here. I was wondering if you could walk us through this graph, what it means, and explain why this collapse in baseload power has driven the kind of crises like we've experienced in New South Wales over the last week.
Yeah, well, thanks, Gerard, for sharing this around. I think when I first started talking about this issue was way back in 2016, 8 years ago. And I think the problem was people used to yawn, but now people are starting to realise this is serious. So what we're basically looking at here is that, you know, the dashed red line there, the vertical line, that's kind of roughly where we are today. The bottom to the left of that on the screen is the system that we've had and we've got currently up until now. And it's dominated, as you can see, by coal-fired power plants. So at the bottom, brown coal plants down in Victoria, and then sitting above those, the black coal plants in New South Wales and Queensland. And then above that, you've got several different types of gas plants, and then the hydro, some more peaking gas turbines, some diesel generators, and then right at the top, wind and solar farms. So what this is showing is actually the capacity. So that's the number of megawatts or gigawatts, gigawatt being 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity of all these different types of generation. And then, of course, the x-axis is time, year by year. And so what this is showing is that there's an expectation that the coal fleet will retire over the next couple of decades. And that's the sort of collapsing cliff, if you like, that you see there. And the reason I haven't allowed the capacity above that to come down and fill that gap is that it can't do the same job as the coal plants do. It can't deliver 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, reliable supply at low cost, like the coal plants can. So we need something to fill that gap. And at the moment, we don't really have anything to fill that gap. The other thing I think to notice here, Gerard, is at the top of the chart, you see the wind and solar. Those assets have quite short lifespans. So by 2050, basically all of the solar panels on rooftops and in solar farms and all of the wind turbines that we've got today, they'll all be past the end of their life by 2050. So there's this huge task ahead of us. But the number one thing is, how do we replace this existing fleet of coal plants?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Stephen. I think your point about the age of some of these assets is really critical and gets lost, that a coal-fired power plant, you get a good 40 to 60 years out of. Nuclear, you can get easily 80 years, and in discussions with KEPCO, they reckon they can get them up over 100 and just keep extending by 10 years at a time. Of course, your wind, your solar, your batteries, you're looking at 20 to 30 year lifespans if you're really lucky. But sort of speaking of this reliable and dispatchable baseload power, I would love to talk about South Australia. So the South Australian government is urgently seeking to restart 2 mothballed diesel power generators, as it warns the state is at risk of blackouts this summer. So diesel generators saving the day in the state that was supposed to lead this renewable revolution. Is this irony, mismanagement, or just proof that this green experiment simply doesn't work?
Well, I think the first thing we have to remember when we talk about any individual state, South Australia or any other state, is that it's actually connected to the larger system. So that's actually quite important. And the second thing is that South Australia is very small in terms of the size of electrical demand on the national electricity market. South Australia is very small. And so it's often held up as a sort of poster child of high shares of wind and solar. But the reason that has been able to work is because when it's not windy and sunny, they're able to pull power across from Victoria, from the whole rest of the eastern system, and connect it through Victoria. And indeed, the converse is also true. So when it's very windy and sunny and there's more output than there is demand in South Australia, they're able to push the excess back across to the east into Victoria. So it's kind of an artificial thing to talk about South Australia as having high shares because of that fact. It's just this small piece of a much bigger picture. But the other thing to remember, this is not just a simple game of balancing energy in an Excel spreadsheet. You know, it's a real physical power system, and it has to maintain stability and system strength and other things all the time. And that's getting harder and harder. And so I think the fact that, and there's still a heavy reliance on gas in South Australia if you look at the data. And I think they're starting to realise that particularly as things get very tight this summer, they'll need additional backup in the form of diesel generators. So I think, as you say, Gerard, that does tell the story that you can't really run a whole system on intermittent, part-time, direct current, weak assets.
What is interesting, Stephen, despite this, what feel like law of physics and laws of engineering and what we've experienced in New South Wales, what South Australia are predicting they're going to experience over the next couple of months, there are still sceptics out there, and quite prominent sceptics, of the necessity of reliable, dispatchable baseload power. So a new report out of the German National Academy of Science and Engineering this week has made the bold claim that an energy system dominated by solar and wind does not require baseload power stations to guarantee supply security. And I quote, a secure energy supply is also possible without baseload power plants. Well, as an adjunct professor in the School of Mechanical and Mining Engineering, and I should say, as an energy economist with over 30 years' experience, I would love your perspective on this. Do we still need baseload power, or have we progressed past it with the marvels of engineering?
Well, look, I think the short answer is we do. So thanks for pointing out that report, Gerard. I will say I've seen the English language news stories about that report, but as far as I can tell, the original report's only been released in German so far, so I don't think there's an English translation of the whole report that's been released yet, and I certainly haven't not yet had the chance to read that report to find out how they've come to that conclusion. My view is that I think that conclusion, it's either wrong or it's being exaggerated. We've got to remember that Germany is interconnected with its neighbours on all sides, north, south, east and west. And I think if my memory's right, there's something like 10 neighbouring country systems that are connected with Germany. So Germany has been able to rely on French baseload power in the form of nuclear power plants for a very long time and up until the present, as well as underpinning supply from other neighbouring countries. So, to look at Germany as if it's an isolated system is actually not correct. It's just not technically correct. And the result, the finding that having plants that are designed to run in the baseload, there's a very long established finding in operations research, which is at the overlap of engineering and economics, which says that the most cost-effective way to meet customer demand that varies from night to day, morning, midday, afternoon, evening, overnight, that the demand varies according to a predictable pattern. And it's a very sound result that says that the lowest cost way to meet such a load shape is with baseload power in the mix. And I've never seen anyone really show convincingly that that's not the case. And so I'm very surprised if this German report can be relied upon.
Well, I wouldn't put it past the English-speaking media to run off with conclusions that weren't exactly in the detail of the report. But as you mentioned, Germany is an interconnected grid to 10 other countries or so. But in Australia, we're an island, and a lot of our investment decisions are informed by the Australian Energy Market Operator's Integrated System Plan, and of course the costings produced in the CSIRO's Gen Cost report. Now, you've been quite outspoken on these two documents, and you've called the levelised cost of electricity model that the CSIRO uses, the LCOE model, fundamentally flawed and misleading. I wonder if you could unpack what LCOE modelling actually is and why you think it's a poor way to inform decisions on the grid.
So levelised cost of energy or levelised cost of electricity is one of the things that you'll find in the Gen Cost report. I should say, Gerard, that in the CSIRO report, they do have a kind of health warning on LCOE, which does warn the reader that it's not appropriate for certain things and it's very limited. But then they go on to quote the numbers, and then unfortunately other people pick up those numbers and quote them without including the health warning. So what LCOE is, it's an answer to a very simple and narrow question, which in simplified form says, if I was to build such and such a power plant, whatever kind of power plant that might be, whether it's wind, solar, gas, coal, nuclear, whatever it is, if I was to build that power plant, I'd have to invest some capital and I'd have some operating costs and maybe fuel cost included in the operating costs if it's a plant that needs fuel. The question, the LCOE is answering this simple question, which is, if I was to sell every unit of electricity that's sent out by that power plant over its lifetime at one single price, in order that I would cover all of my operating costs and recover my investment, just recover the investment at, exactly, based on how much I need to, the interest rate I need to pay on the debt and the returns I need to give to the shareholders. If I was to just cover all that with one single price for the whole life of the plant, what would that number be? That's what LCOE tells you. And it's a very narrow question. It's focused on, it just draws a little box around that one particular power plant. And it assumes that whenever the owner of that power plant wants to send electricity out into the system can accept it, the system continues to function, and it can accept the power. And so, it doesn't give you a picture of the whole of the power system. And it makes enormous assumptions. So if you're talking about one very small power system as part of one very small power plant, I should say, as part of a huge power system, then it's, from an investor point of view, an interesting number to know about. But it doesn't give you the ability to talk about replacing all of the plants in the entire system with one or two types of plants, for example. And that's the way that this metric's being abused by people who don't really understand the total system cost and what's actually required to run a power system.
And I think that's the challenge, and with all of us, it really being led too much by modelling, and that modelling can inform, but it should never be the dictator of a certain policy direction. I think it was Nick Cater that gave me the old adage, it works in practice, but can we make it work in theory? And this is the challenge when engineering principles that are mashing up against these kind of models that these different bodies are spitting out. I'm conscious we're nearly out of time, but I'd just love to close with, what do we actually do about the kind of stasis that we're in at the moment, particularly with regards to energy policy? And what do you think actually needs to be done in order to deliver lower energy bills and provide more reliable power?
Oh, Gerard, that's the sort of $64 billion question, isn't it? I think the first thing we've got to do is we've got to stop this frenzied panic. So many of the policy decisions that are being advocated are all based on this frenzied panic. That we've got to stop emitting CO2, the day after tomorrow, that we've got to rush to close the existing fleet of plants before there's something ready to replace them. It's all a frenzied rush. So I think we need to stop, calm down, take a deep breath and stop that frenzied panic. And then we need to recognise that we've got to respect the laws of physics, and we should start listening to some of the cautious, experienced, older engineers who've been warning about the direction we're heading for quite some time. And we need to pay due regard to established engineering principles. And one of those is, avoid single points of failure like the plague. And unfortunately, the direction we're travelling in at the moment is creating a gigantic single point of failure. It's called the weather. We're building a weather-dependent system, and that's a really bad violation of one of the most basic engineering principles that there is.
Stephen, depressing, but there's hope that with minds like yours, fighting the good fight, that maybe common sense and cooler heads will prevail. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Gerard. It's a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for tonight in Reality Bites. A very special thanks to Robert Bryce, Professor Stephen Wilson, and of course, Nick Cater. I'm Gerard Holland, and it's been my pleasure to sit in the hot seat for the last 2 weeks. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, hoping to be back on ADH at some time next year. But until then, I hope you have an amazing time with your families, and God bless. See you later.